Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Modern Sales Pros digital panel, So You Want to Be a CRO, sponsored by the team at MetaCX. Really excited today. We've got some new panelists with us, some amazing returning panelists, so it should be a good conversation. But before we jump into this, Lou and Jill, both of you, this is your first time joining us on a Modern Sales Pros panel, so thank you. We do
Absolutely.
have a little bit of a tradition that started since the start of the pandemic. We always like to learn a little bit more about our panelists. So, Jill, we'll start with you. Any new hobbies or skills, anything that you've picked up or refined since the start of the pandemic?
Definitely office decorating. I would say is making sure I have a decent background. That's first and foremost. And I'm actually even thinking about redoing this, so changing it frequently. But seriously, just engaging with individuals. And I'm Italian, so I use my hands anyway, but just making sure that you're making eye contact, engaging, laughing, because sitting on Zoom calls all day long is taxing. So you still want to have fun on the job and make it real.
Oh, that's awesome. And hopefully it's fun today. We can use our hands. There's not going to be any restrictions on that, so don't worry about that. And then Lou, longtime ally and friend of MSP, event attendee, but first time panelist. Anything you've honed or picked up since the start of the pandemic?
Yeah, probably two things. First one, I've gotten really good at surviving on the crusts of my kids' peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch, which has been great. The second one, like I was never a person that would carve off parts of my calendar during the day to like do a certain thing. And I started doing that just because I didn't want to have to come back down to my basement office to work all night. And so my time management's gotten a lot better. I feel like I'm more effective. I've just like, sectioned off my day a lot better. So I hope I carry that with me in the future too. See.
Now, important question, are the crusts set aside for you or are you just like scavenging crusts when you get a moment?
Pure scavenging, okay. Yeah.
Perfect, that's good. One of the key characteristics of a CRO, being able to hustle, you're hearing it here first from Lou.
Totally.
And then Jake, it's good to have you back again. Anything new that you've picked up since the start of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this the last time we met up, become kind of obsessed with the Peloton. It has kept me sane.
There it is. Excellent. Well, excited to have you all here today. We've got a great set of conversations to go through. So we're going to jump into it. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Our event is hosted by the team at Modern Sales Pros. For those of you who don't know, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest community for revenue leaders. So that's for folks that are in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales enablement, and the related supporting disciplines. Our mission is to create an environment for our community members where they can answer questions they'd otherwise struggle to solve on their own. So this could be through bringing together panelists like what we have here today to talk about a challenge that's top of mind, like what is the present and future of the Chief Revenue Officer role. That's through robust online discussions. And once we all get jabbed, we'll get back to our in-person events. Community has about 20,000 members and growing, and we have representation from about 6,000 organizations. So the great part about it is when you have a challenge or a question, there's a good chance somebody else has gone through it, and there's a good opportunity for you to get perspective from a number of different high-growth organizations. Membership is free, and for those of you who aren't members that are on today, you will be invited to join afterwards, and we certainly encourage you to check it out. But enough about Modern Sales Pros. Today's program wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship of the team at MetaCX. I'll hand it off to Jake to say just a few words about MetaCX. Jake?
Thanks, Richard. So MetaCX, the best way to think about MetaCX is we're a platform that enables suppliers, say B2B SaaS companies, to more effectively align with suppliers, their customers, around a shared definition of value. So that starts with aligning sellers with prospects around a mutual success plan to define a set of target outcomes. Nailing the handoff, the post-sales handoff, is typically a moment of disappointment. We want to make it a moment of delight. And then finally, the ability to take those defined outcomes and illuminate them with real data to demonstrate proof of performance or value realization in that relationship. So for any company that has a recurring revenue model, and I'm sure we'll step into that in today's discussion, it's really a way to ensure that you are framing the relationship in a way that creates alignment between both the supplier and the buyer through the lens of a set of outcomes that then you can then prove have been achieved over the course of that relationship.
Awesome. And we're real excited to be working with MetaCX to pull together today's session. And today, one of the great parts about having these panelists on is they've all got great perspective on this chief revenue officer role from all different angles. But when we were planning this program, we really started to think about this through the lens of like, what's the current and future state of the CRO? And today we're going to be talking about that. But in addition, each one of our panelists is going to put on rub their crystal ball and let us know what the right characteristics of a CRO will look like 5-10 years in the future. So you're going to hear some future looking and some kind of present looking of how we got here. So with that, I'll hand it off to Jake to introduce himself and students take us away. Jake.
Thanks, Richard. Jake Soroffman, president of MetaCX. I joined the company about 8 months ago. Before that, I was a CMO, ran marketing for Pendo, super fast growing SaaS company. And before that, I took a bit of a hiatus from my CMO career. I was chief of research at Gartner, focused on digital marketing, CMO topics. So I think my orientation here is really around someone who now has stepped into a broader revenue role, but has historically had to partner very closely with CROs to ensure that marketing is contributing to the growth of the company in a way that's attributable back to real revenue impact.
And hello, I'm Jill Chiara, and I am a new CRO at MetaCX. I've only been on board for, I think this is week number 7, but it feels like several years, and it feels like a fantastic fit. I'm super excited. I've been on the commercial side for 25 plus years. And most of my background was at Forrester Research, where I launched the data business and helped it grow, and throughout lots of different data launches. Once I left there, I went into SaaS sales, building enterprise SaaS teams, and growing those businesses, which typically started in the SMB or mid-level market and then moved into enterprise. So again, that's exactly what I intend to do here. And as CRO, I intend to do it at a more strategic level. So I'm excited.
And hello, I'm Lou Orfanos, and right now I am the GM and the head of product for the CRM and the sales products at HubSpot, and really fast-growing line of business for HubSpot. Tens and thousands of customers, kind of a disruptive entrant to the CRM space in the last few years, and so really excited about what's happening there. It's been fun sort of being on this side of sales, where I work with a lot of CROs and revenue teams to talk about what makes a great CRM. Just before this, I was at a company called Localytics, where I was running the sales team for a little while. I also ran the customer team there, and so I've sort of seen that part, realized I wasn't probably the best at it, and went back to sort of my roots in the product world. But I have seen both sides. It's been really interesting, applying the lessons from being in a SaaS startup, running the front office, to trying to build a product that does that well. So I'm excited to be here and talk about this. I've just got so much I want to talk about. It's gonna be great.
Oh, and thank you all so much for your time today. And for our attendees, just 2 housekeeping notes. First thing, the recording will be available. We'll share that with everybody after the session. And then secondly, you've heard the background here. We've got a ton of perspective and experience on what works and what doesn't. We've got some hot takes coming up as well. But do use this opportunity to learn from Jake, Jill, and Lou. Really, really great backgrounds here. And with that, let's jump into it. So let's talk a little bit about how we kind of got here. How did we get to this point where there's the CRO role, and how have you seen it evolve as you've been in SaaS? And Jill, I think you're unique in this in a little bit. So let's actually start with you and get some perspective.
Absolutely. So yeah, the CRO role is a much broader remit than let's say a CSO role. So CROs are going to be looking at, as you said, across the customer life cycle. So not just new business, but renewal business, growth business, looking at the lifetime value of a customer, looking at those key metrics in SaaS, including net revenue retention, and really understanding how to grow the business overall. And so that, as I mentioned before, is a strategic role as well. So you're not just looking at Salesforce and spreadsheets and looking at deals coming in, but you're thinking about what is the long-term nature and growth trajectory of this business.
And I think this is something too, where your background is a little bit unique. One of the first things you said was you're a CRO who doesn't want to. Let's share that perspective.
Oh yeah, I forgot I said that. I'm a CRO, so I'm not in the camp that a CRO needs to own marketing, because marketing is its own very large remit in and of itself, right? So I would not be the best marketer. But I think it's critical for CROs to lock arms with marketers. And it's never, well, they didn't do this, so this is why we're not meeting our numbers. It's, we are a partnership. We need to do these things together in lockstep. But I don't think CROs need to own marketing.
Well, and I think, Jake, we've got a marketer or someone with strong marketing chops here in the background. I mean, is this universal, or is this different based on company stage and life cycle?
I don't think it's universal. I think it's probably the prevailing bias, what Jill is saying, and I agree 1,000%. I think when CROs run marketing, they tend to be sales leaders who are creating demand generation, but probably neglecting brand. It becomes just weaker marketing. There needs to be, as Jill said, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into doing marketing right. And if you're trying to focus on, building a sales organization and hitting your quarterly revenue targets, chances are you're not paying too close attention to the longer range considerations of what it means to build a brand.
Yeah, I don't know. I just, sorry, Reg. Yeah, not to like bury a little bit of the lead here for later, but it does seem like things are changing in that for a long time you had all your back office stuff, and then you have the customer. And the way that we sort of filled the gap there was you had a marketer who got leads, you had the salespeople who would sell, and then you had sort of the customer success that would manage the customer post-sale. A lot of what's happening is that experience is so much more important than it ever was today. So I see it coming together a lot. It's not to say that the CRO has to run everything, but if they're not perfectly in step with everybody managing that customer flywheel, it's going to be a bit of a problem, right? And so that's why I think we're going to talk about chief customer officers later and how they play in. And so it's interesting. I think some CROs may want to own the whole thing, but if not, just be best friends with everybody else, and that'll work.
Yeah, 100%.
Exactly.
I think the other thing that we talked about last time was like the one that is bringing that together is RevOps right now. It seems to be the role that sort of emerged beyond sales ops to sort of manage the whole cycle. It's all the same data, right? And so it seems to me that RevOps is sort of the first foray into that role, thinking about the whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. RevOps becomes kind of the glue that holds those functions together operationally. No doubt.
I think one of the questions that always comes up with a chief revenue officer, anytime you hear that role, there's some dogma around what it is and what it isn't. And that rubber always hits the road, or that point of conflict generally is always who owns upsells, who owns renewals, who owns new business. And Jake, I want your perspective on this first, just because obviously where you've been and how you've done it in the past. But what do you think? Who owns renewals? Who owns upsells? Who owns new business? Is that all a CRO?
The CRO more often than not, the CRO owns the entire revenue cycle. So it's acquisition, it's retention, and it's expansion. And they likely have executives reporting to them that are responsible for each of those specific areas, like a CCO or VP of customer success who's responsible for renewal and expansion, and then maybe some segmented sales leadership that's focused on different segments where there's an account management focus on more strategic high value accounts that are looking at it more full life cycle. But yeah, ultimately that's the CRO's responsibility. I think that's what really draws the distinction between a CRO and ahead of sales is looking at the full revenues life cycle.
I think that there's also this interesting conversation that we had in our prep session about sales development reps, right? Now, I know this is a little bit adjacent to our conversation today, but Jill, I know you had some very strong opinions on this. Where does sales development, or where do sales development reps typically live? Where's their canonical home?
Yeah, so they typically live in sales, but I really don't think it matters where they live, because the organization, if you have alignment, really good alignment between marketing and sales, or the revenue team, then it doesn't matter where they live, because they have an important role, and that is to create opportunities from marketing leads. And so marketing wants that and sales wants it. And they're gold, right? So you know when it's not working, right? So I've worked in organizations where it sits in marketing, and I've worked in organizations where it sits in sales, and they've both worked well.
Isn't the key there, Jill, like if that's going to work, don't you have to sort of assign or partner up the SDR with certain sales reps and just make that like a glued relationship together, even if they report? Yeah, right. Like you can handle that with a matrix if you get it right. Yeah. Okay.
I think the tighter relationship you can make between an SDR and a rep, the more you're going to get out of it. Because remember, an SDR is on the bench, right? And they ultimately want to be, most folks want to become a salesperson. So they need a mentor and they need a coach on a regular basis.
Yeah, and the way that I've thought about it, I totally agree that it really depends on the individual. It almost doesn't matter where they report. If there's one rule of thumb that I've applied in the past, it's typically company life cycle or maturity. So if a company is earlier stage, then it might make sense to have SDRs reporting up to marketing, because it allows you to close the loop on sort of identifying messaging and sort of problem solution match and ICP and things that are and aren't resonating. To the extent that you have that within the marketing team, it just makes it easier to sort of capture and learn from that knowledge. And then as you start to scale as an organization, post product market fit, post problem solution match, then it becomes much more of an operational function that lives under the sales leader.
Yeah, I think the intersection between the orgs is like one of the more fascinating things here, where sales and marketing, it's the SDRs, sales and service, it's like account management and CS, and what do you do there? One of the things I learned since our last session is that at HubSpot, we had been comping our customer success people on customer dollar retention, and we're going to change that to revenue retention. And it doesn't put a number on their head necessarily. It's just a goal, and the salespeople have the number, but it's just another way that you can use incentives to sort of keep people in line. I don't know. We'll see how it's going to work, but that's sort of the intent there.
I think that's a great idea. I've done that in another organization, and it made a big difference.
And I think we're starting to hit on this concept a little bit. So let's actually go forward here and talk about the CRO and chief customer officer and like kind of playing nice in the sandbox. And I think, you know, it is what is a chief customer officer? How does it interact with a CRO? Like, how does this all hang together? Because that's an even newer role than CRO. Jake, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a nebulous role. I think we can all agree on that. It sounds like, you know, I think there's really three variants of what a CCO could and should become. The first is more of like a strategic lens, where they're the advocate for the customer. They focus on the outside in view, what the customer needs and wants, and they advocate for that across the entire organization. And they have more of an advisory and strategic role rather than an operational role within the business. The second variant is actually, I think HubSpot has this variant, Lou, which is more operationally focused on the entire life cycle. So chief customer officer owns sales, marketing, and success, which is a really big job. So it's kind of like CRO++. And then the third variant is, frankly, a glorified VP of customer success. And I don't mean that sound pejorative. It's just, it's narrowly focused on the CS function. And it just is sometimes an inflated title. Sometimes it just means that they're a more senior individual and maybe they have different reporting lines than a VP of customer success would, but their purview is narrower.
I think there's a lot to it. And I also think that's the age-old story with the CRO role, right? 10 years ago, that was a place for your VP of sales to go when he or she
Something
needed
to promote them into.
yeah, you needed a promotion, right? Okay, cool. Hey, Lou, you've done a good job here. Why don't you step on up to this new thing? Well, we don't really know what it means.
Yeah. I don't know. I had this line in the sand when we talked last time, which was like, if your chief customer officer isn't at least a peer with sales and marketing leadership, I think it's just kind of a vanity title at that point.
Yeah.
And so like make it a peer. And then I saw somebody ask a question in here about, doesn't it sort of then conflict with revenue? Maybe, but if you can get the incentives right within each group, you can do it right if you do sort of treat them as peers. So I don't know. It's possible. It's possible.
I agree with that.
I have more thoughts on the matter if you guys want to hear it. No, I'm just kidding.
Go for it. I think Richard may have frozen up.
That's what we're waiting for.
Yeah.
No, we do have, I'm going to talk about the HubSpot thing a little bit, because I think a lot of times when a company's trying to say that they're super customer centric, they will create this title, they'll put somebody in the role, but they won't give them the right level of empowerment, right? And so I think like the reason we did this was the intent was have a chief customer officer, but functionally they own everything. And therefore, if customer's not at the center of every decision, clearly they're not doing it the right way. So you can actually embed that in your operating system probably if you really care too.
Yeah, I think it's smart. Are you familiar with a lot of other companies that are organized that way, Lou? Because I haven't heard of a lot of companies that have.
I was talking to the woman's name is Yamini at HubSpot, and I was talking to her about that the other day. And she said that she's found a small handful, and she thinks it's the wave, like the tip of the spear for the role, and they're going to try to put an organization together and try to get a community going on it. But it is pretty new. There's not a lot of them out there, especially in scaling SaaS at this point.
Yeah, for sure.
Because think about the experience to run all those. It's kind of a rare breed of person probably to get that level of experience.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think Richard's back.
Sorry about that, gang. Just getting settled here. Did we get to Ed Porter's question here about, I feel like that's where I dropped off here. So Ed had a question around CRO doesn't own marketing and is peer to the chief customer officer. Why did we change chief sales officer to chief revenue officer? Did we handle that one?
I think a little bit. Yeah, we talked about sort of the difference in like incentives of the groups, and they can sit next to each other without revenue sort of impinging on it.
Perfect. Okay. And then I'm going to just resume sharing here and we should be good. So really, I think the other question here that we've started to hit on, we've mentioned this as kind of a chief advocate, having it be really, really interdisciplinary and having that relationship be one of advocacy across and on behalf of that customer lifecycle. One question that I actually think is interesting, and Jake, I'm going to pose this to you. Which one comes first organizationally? Is a CCO something that comes at a later point in time than a chief revenue officer? Or do you see these kind of rising to prominence as peers in an organization?
Yeah, I think typically the CRO would come first. Of course, you need to have someone leading the CS function. So it really depends on how you define it. It all comes down to semantics, right? It's all how you define what a CCO does. But in the more conventional definition of a CCO having broader remit and really advocating for the customer, that's a role that typically comes later. You grow into that role.
I would agree. And I think that, when you're a startup, you want to begin to build your client list. Obviously, the CRO is going to be front and center in that process. But I think what's really important once you have various customers is to be in touch with them more and understand who are going to be your customer advocates and who will help you design for the future. And getting that voice of the customer into your organization is critical. And I think that's where a CCO role has a lot of power and play. But I also think that that's a big responsibility of the CRO. So that's a connection point for them where they both should be focused on who are the top customers of ours who are pushing us outside of our comfort zone as an organization.
I think that those are some great points and certainly some interesting evolution here. couple live questions coming in. Folks in the audience, please do keep those coming. Go ahead and use the upvote function for anything that seems particularly interesting for you. One question, and we had talked a little bit about this last time. So if you've got your chief customer officer, you've got your chief revenue officer, where do things like customer programs, like the customer marketing aspect fall into it, especially if you have a CMO? My goodness, bear with me here. Jill, what do you think about that? Like that kind of customer program space, where would that fit into this C-suite, I guess?
No, that's why I think marketing needs to have its own function. So I think it needs to sit with marketing, and the CCO and the CRO need to drive that, because the CCO, it's front and center. They want to market to their customers. They want adoption. They want usage. They want growth. They want renewals. But the CRO wants lifetime value of the customer. And so they've spent a ton of time and money bringing on these customers. And in the first year, they're typically not profitable. So they only win when the customer is a customer for 2, 3, 4, 5 years plus. And so, short answer is the CMO.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Customer marketing definitely fits within marketing. In my experience, there's really been 2 variants of that. And I think it's kind of an interesting debate, which one makes more sense. There's looking at really kind of 3 funnels within marketing. There's the inbound funnel, which is product-led. There's the outbound funnel, which is sales-led. And then there's the customer funnel, which is customer-led. So this is really kind of looking at signals that would indicate the opportunity to expand or cross-sell within existing accounts. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is aligning by segments and thinking about the role of marketing as full life cycle across all 3 of those funnels. So SMB, mid-market, enterprise, and they own the entire revenue cycle in the same way the CRO would. And when I was in the process, during my later part of my tenure at Pendo, we were in the process of pivoting from the individual funnels to more of a segment aligned full life cycle view of marketing, to make sure that it was aligned again with the CRO and how they were thinking about the world.
Yeah, Jake, you made me think of something. I think like as you're starting to think about the role of the CRO and like what really delineates that, there's probably like 2 things that you should be thinking that you may not be thinking if you're a VP of sales, right? Like the first one is you probably moving from thinking about the sales motion and like, are the SDRs lined up the right way? Are we getting the right leads? Are we doing this? Are we reaching out enough? You're thinking now about the go-to-market motion, right? And you're thinking like, should freemium have a role in this? Should we be leveraging partners here? You should be like expanding. And then I think the other one is the full customer life cycle, right? If you can start to think of this as more of a flywheel than you do think of it as sort of just a pure funnel, you're probably, that's a different way to think. And I think someone had a question here around, like, is this a design thinking problem? Like, yeah, it probably is. If you put equal weight on every part of a customer lifecycle and you think advocates are just as important as new leads, you would probably design a system around that sort of elevated all those roles and getting to all those differently, which I think is important.
Yeah, love that.
I think there's a lot there, and I think that last piece, that advocate story, I think is now probably more apparent for many SaaS revenue leaders than it ever has been. Where do you find your most pipeline? Talk to your existing customers. Where are you going to find your most enterprise value? Speak with your existing customers. Where are you going to find potentially new customers? Well, when your existing customers move somewhere else and had a great experience, they're gonna carry you along and bring you with them.
And importantly, and I think this is often overlooked, connect your customers together, right? They can learn from each other. And I think that when you think about customer marketing programs, they're often seen as sort of one directional. And when you make them many to many, multi-directional, it just becomes incredibly rich and effective.
It's funny. It's almost like communities are a thing that are valuable in times when people are all isolated at home.
Totally.
Let's move forward here. We got a bunch of good questions coming in, but I want you each to put on kind of your goggles, look into the future, and talk a little bit about where you see the common background? What are the characteristics? Like, what's a CRO going to look like, and who's going to be sitting in these seats in 5 years? And Lou, you're building a product to help excite and delight some of these folks. So let's start with you here. What do we think CROs are going to look like? What are backgrounds going to be for these folks in 5 years?
Okay, I'm going to do an extreme version of this, which I don't know if it's going to take shape, but you could imagine a world where the portfolio of how you sell something shifts dramatically to include e-commerce as a much bigger component of the sale. And if that's the case, the role of sales changes a little bit, right? So like there are definitely sellers, but maybe sales is there more to be coaches or for relationships or something like that. Let's take this extreme view. And so you've effectively balanced out a portfolio that includes sort of e-commerce, maybe freemium, maybe sales. What that means is that you need to understand business models a little bit better. You need to understand operations more than you ever did before. And so in this sort of fake world I've created, the CRO of the future should probably be like a revenue ops background with some technology understanding, who has hopefully carried a bag at some point, because I don't know if you can get the empathy for those that do. But I think they're more customer experience leaning than they are sales process leaning. And so that would be the way that I would maybe think about it if I had to think of like a extreme end of the spectrum future.
I like your definition. I would say they're strategic, they're operational, and they're data-driven. They know how to build and scale teams. They know how to think about efficiency and effectiveness. And they know how to activate and grow new revenue engines. So what are the new sources of revenue on future horizons that you need to start thinking about? So it's not just the current state business, it's the future state business.
And if I were to round it out, I would say that the future CRO needs to be consultative, right? So even having a strategy and consulting background could be quite helpful. Strategy and planning is critical as a part of this role. Pricing and packaging is critical. Those are levers you can pull that are short-term and long-term. And consultative to the executive team, and making sure that, founders or CEOs or whomever across the executives are building products and services that are lined up to the market and what the market needs currently, because sometimes that's a little out of whack. And so I think it's the CRO that needs to bring in that consultative perspective and coach so that those targets can be met appropriately.
It's interesting, and you've all said some variation of this, but it really is that operational mindset of thinking about the revenue org almost like a factory that's making revenue for your organization. It's not about just sales or retention, but it really is, Lou, I love that idea, like pull it kind of up and abstract a little bit. Like traditionally, I'm running a factory that's making revenue for my organization. Here are some ways to think about it. Jill, you mentioned this kind of consulting background, and I'm curious, I want to double click into that a little bit more. I find sometimes that those folks are a little bit maybe too abstracted away, right? They don't necessarily have the executional chops. They can tell you kind of how they think it should work, but can't actually get shit done. What do you think about that? Is there a fine line there?
There is a fine line. And I think if you have some type of strategy and consulting role and you've carried a bag, that's perfect.
Otherwise, you just make really beautiful PowerPoint presentations.
Just lots and lots and lots of hand waving. Like, oh, it'll kind of work like this.
But it doesn't even have to be at a big consulting company. That's probably the worst case scenario, right? This is more about where were you if you were in some type of strategy role in a software company, where you were helping bring products to market, where you were planning out financial transformations for the organization. And I think, it's not an exact path, but just the type of experience that you've had is what makes up a unique CRO.
I think growth rate really plays a very significant role in this as well. If a company is growing very, very fast, it gets harder as you get bigger, and you have to think differently. It's like the strategy that worked before doesn't work in the future. So the ability to figure out how to put together the right combination of geographies and channels and And thinking about how you scale that way and getting the timing right is really, really important. It's kind of an orchestration challenge in a way.
Yeah, the scale also, growth rate actually also probably lets you get teed up for more opportunities, right? In terms of like, oh, there's an experiment running over here. I could maybe go take this thing on, run it end to end, but it's super small.
Yeah.
And then get some of that muscle built up. So that's, if you are looking to sort of expand your skill set, I think small but fast growing where experiments are sort of prioritized is actually an interesting play.
Yeah, I like that.
There's actually an interesting comment right now in the questions, and I'll paraphrase. There's a strong push, and I can put this in the chat panel for our panelists here too. This is some research coming from McKinsey. Much more likely for a buyer to be ready to self-serve or buy online. This also lines up with Brian Halligan's consumerization of enterprise buying. So in this world where product-led growth or self-serve, freemium or otherwise becomes more and more of a priority, even for bigger transactions, how does that then change what maybe our CROs are doing today? It's a little bit of a variation, but Jake, let's start with you on that because you've had marketing and some of the revenue.
That's a really, really great question. I think that the best sales organizations are hybrid. So when you look at like best in class examples of companies, even like Atlassian, largely an inbound business. And until recently, they didn't have materially any AEs. It was essentially just conversion off of freemium and trial. And you grew the company as you drooled in your pillow at night. It's a beautiful thing in theory. Most companies can't pull it off. But I think that there's also, you have to think about this in terms of segmentation. Certainly the lower end of the market will lend itself very well to that inbound freemium model. As you move up market, there may be some trials that are happening in a self-service way, but it's going to be a much more hands-on sale. I think in both cases, there is the risk of losing control over differentiation and value and the sales cycle itself if you don't apply an enterprise sales motion or more traditional sales motion, even if it's product-led to begin with. So I almost think of it as like, and I hope this makes sense, when you think about the segmentation of your sales organization, where you might have, say, SMB and mid-market are largely product-led inbound, and then enterprise is much more like traditional sales-led. There's still a product component in both of those segments. Like product component, it's just where it falls in sequence. So in the lower end of the market, product-led is what initiates the sales opportunity. In more in the higher end of the market, the product really comes into play around POCs and proof of value and managed trials. And there's still product signals that are important to understand as part of managing that sales process.
Yeah,
so the answer is both.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think there's a great point to be said on that. As somebody who used to work closely with solutions engineering and complex enterprise sales, right? If the product can be self-served onto, it makes your POC or trial process hopefully easier, right? You can deploy the solution a little bit easier. The transact may still be a pain in the butt because of security or procurement or otherwise, but it does put you in a position where at least that initial deployment behaves like product-led growth, but it's just Jake, to your point, it's just a little bit later in the process.
I have this 2x2 that I use, and so Rich, don't kill me, but I might like draw it here. Look at this. So I think about this like, how much change is your product introducing to the buyer, and then how expensive is it relative to typical purchases? This is one way to look at it. So like here it might be like in your personal life, like you're buying a house, right? A lot of change. It's a place you got to move a lot of money. Here might be like, a toothbrush or something like that. And then like maybe here is a mattress. It's expensive, but it's not new. The way I think about a CRO role is like, you should look at this thing and calibrate your go-to-market around each of these. And so there's these different vectors, like what's the role of sales in a toothbrush sale? If 6 sales reps came up to you in CVS, you would probably lose your mind. So like you need to step back and think about like advertising and product information, et cetera. Whereas a mattress, like maybe you want to talk to someone, but it's kind of up to you. A house, you probably need help. There's like different ways to calibrate. So I always say, pick which of these quadrants you're in and think about the layers which like you layer in sales, you layer in success and what you do differently. It's always a fun one for me. Sorry, I didn't mean to draw and mess everything up, but it's a fun one.
Lou, that's awesome. I took a screenshot. It's fantastic.
I love your toothbrush.
Thank you very much. Thank you
It's
very much.
impressive.
I'm excited for the 6 sales reps to come up to me and try to sell me one at CVS. That sounds like a mind-numbing experience. We get a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to actually turn the slides off so Lou can't draw anymore. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, but we're going to move on to questions and answers here. And there's a bunch. One of the first ones is, and I'm going to paraphrase kind of 2 of these. I'll throw it in the chat panel for our audience, for our panelists as well. But the idea behind the relationship of the CRO and the CMO, there's some schools of thought that, hey, marketing needs to be underneath a chief revenue officer. And we've got CEOs throwing around vanity titles, but like, let's be serious here. It's really got to be underneath marketing. It's really got to be underneath the CRO. The question here is, working from that perspective, how do you approach working at an organization that maybe already has a CMO as a CRO? And Jill, let's start with you on this, just because you're a little bit newer into your organization now.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, it could go either way. I personally would not want to focus on marketing right now because I have such a great marketing team. I join all the marketing meetings, right? And I have a marketing funnel that they contribute to. So I feel like we're connected and we're on one team. I'd say, it would need to sit under a CRO if things were broken and if things weren't working well. If they're working well, again, I don't think it matters as long as those individuals at the top are accountable and communicative and have excellent working relationships. So again, it may be the way of the world, but at some point, a CRO will just become a president of an organization or a COO. So let's not mar all of that, and let's stay pretty focused on the revenue side of it. Not that marketing isn't a critical component of that, but I do believe marketing is its own craft and specialty, and most CROs do not come from marketing backgrounds. And so should CROs actually be the ones, marketing is a really tough thing. And it changes faster than any other part of an organization. And you have to be so on the move with the next thing to do. So I just think it takes someone who's leading that team, who's super, super senior. Have the CMO report into the CRO.
No.
Agree. I agree with that. All right, Jake, I'll give my take real quick and then we'll go. I agree. I think I actually don't like the CRO with the marketer reporting to them, just because the CRO is often a salesperson. That's like just the typical background. And so change it to a chief customer officer and have a sales, marketing, and success person work for them. Otherwise, you're going to create, I think it's just the nature of human interaction, where you might create a weird power dynamic where sales feels superior to marketing, or maybe vice versa, depending on how it goes. So you ideally don't want to hire those kind of people and set that dynamic. But if you want to send the message and build a structure that says customers are first, then you'd put everybody on an equal playing field in some way. That would be my 2 cents on it.
I can live with that, Lou. Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
So the one thing I would suggest for anyone who's trying to create alignment between the CRO and the CMO, or sales and marketing more broadly, is just make sure that you're aligned around funnel stage definitions and goals. And that alone is going to carry a whole lot of weight. The other thing that is really important is hold marketing accountable to close won ARR and pipeline contribution. Those things will create a lot of alignment between the 2 organizations. I find that the greater challenge is really in the area of product marketing and sales enablement, and making those functions work well together. The demand side is actually pretty straightforward if you do it well.
I think there's a lot there to unpack, and I think there's a bunch of questions that have come in around. And Bill and Lou, you mentioned this a little bit on the compensation, right? Lou, you had mentioned you'd moved, I think it was CS had moved to net dollar retention, something like that. Question coming in from David Fox here. And David's question is, does a CRO kind of today and tomorrow, present time, focus more on growth and net new logos, which is kind of like the traditional model, or does that person focus more on the Roberge model of net dollar retention, making sure the customer journey is successful, kind of like the Roberge model of like healthy, responsible scaling of the business? I'm seeing some aggressive head nods here. Jake, maybe we'll start with you. You can weigh in on this a little bit.
Yeah, the answer is yes. I think it is a little bit of both. But if I were forced to pick a side, it would be the Roberge model. So I think that more enlightened and effective CROs really do focus on NRR, net revenue retention, LTV, and really making it a great experience and delivering the right value equation to customers. And that's different from the depleting resource of new logo acquisition. That's I think a bit out of fashion. Of course, you do need that piece to work as well. It's just where one puts the emphasis.
I completely agree. I mean, if you're a new company, there's not much NRR to focus on, right? But as you grow, NRR is your most important SaaS metric.
Yeah, I think it's certainly an important piece of, as I think we've all mentioned, at the different stages of the life cycle, it may be a little bit different. The other I would encourage folks to take a look at, if you haven't, the team at Winning by Design has what they call the sustainable growth model. It lines up nicely with those who've reviewed Mark Roberge's Science of Reestablishing Growth. I think is his next blog post book that's coming out. A couple more questions here on just the background of a CRO. There's a couple comments in here like, hey, hold on. Why is it just, if they've only got a background in sales, why are we giving them a bigger title if they've never run marketing, if they've never had to work cross-functionally? Like, why does that happen? More so, and how do we adjust that? And Jill, let's kind of start with you on that one.
Sure. Well, so I actually had at Forrester, I ran a P&L. So I had research, consulting, sales, CS. I had my own marketers on my team as well. And I had a bunch of data gurus as well. So I ran kind of a business within a business. And so when you run a P&L, you understand those levers that are needed, right? I was always, the sales team was my favorite. It wasn't my statisticians because they confused the hell out of me, but I did understand the dynamic of the entire team and growing that business. So I think that's my advantage. And I would say that just having a sales role only puts you at a slight disadvantage. And it's better if you've had a little bit more of a wider background.
And I think it's kind of self-selecting, even if you haven't had P&L responsibility. If you're a sales leader and you tend to be more strategic and operationally focused, then you're probably on that track. If you're just a deal person and you're really not as energized by the idea of growing teams and defining strategy and channels, et cetera, it may not be for you.
I think there's a lot to be said about that P&L ownership, because you do in a microcosm, right? You do have an idea of, I have X dollars to spend and I can deploy them in different places. Where am I gonna spend it? Marketing dollars for the toothbrush? Is it going to be salespeople to help with the house? Is it going to be a better website for back to lose? What was the bottom right? Mattress. The mattress. Like, am I going to help with that? A couple more questions coming in here, more on just strategy of CROs. So Max Greenwald's got a question here. Max Greenwald has a question here. Should CROs be, in general, pushing their teams, their CS teams, to be revenue generating? Should CS teams follow their advocates to new companies and own the new logo sale there? Kind of a tricky question to answer, because I think it starts out with maybe it depends. But Lou, let's start with you on this. So should CROs really be leaning into CS to be revenue generating?
I think to some extent, yes. It obviously depends on the business model. Let's say you're selling big ASP enterprise deals, you could probably afford to partner salespeople with CS people in a closer one-to-one relationship on deals. If it's more transactional, you could start to do like service qualified leads or support qualified leads and like work on a way to get to bubble up those opportunities as a sales team. So I think they should be pushing for more accountability in the sales process. It just depends on ASP, your revenue model, but there's got to be something beyond, you know, throwing an account plan over the wall or sharing support tickets or something like that. So I think a little bit further into the process is a very, very healthy thing to be doing.
I think it's challenging to have sales folks own CS functions. I mean, I've never seen sales folks who really want to dig in and do a ton of work on handoff, and like they check in months later on, you know, are we doing exactly what we said we would do? I mean, that's not really a typical salesperson. And I rarely see CS people who want to close a deal, and they usually are pretty uncomfortable asking for business. But CS people can be motivated by growth in their plans. And if you partner sales and CS together, there are some miracles that can happen. But typically the hiring profile is very different.
So yeah, I totally agree with that. One of the things that I've seen done is really kind of bifurcating the CS function into those that are focused on customer health and happiness and those that are focused on renewal and expansion. So to Jill's point, it's rare to find someone who can do both of those things well. And it creates kind of a weird dynamic when you're both trying to be an advocate for the customer, but also trying to take money from them. So splitting those two functions, and then also adding in a install base selling layer within your sales organization that's driven by CQLs, customer qualified leads, that are coming in through the customer success team for the purpose of new lands within that account. So the expansion motion is managed by the CS team. The CS team focused on renewal and expansion, but then net new growth within those accounts is handled by install-based sellers.
Yeah, Jake and Jill, I think like if we took all the things that we just mentioned and you lay those on an interaction map of how many different people talk to a customer, we'd probably all be mortified, right? So then there's like intelligent trade-offs you have to make about like, okay, maybe the reps need to hold on to this forever instead of having an account manager sell. Maybe we do blend that customer health person with the renewal person just for the sake of not another over-the-top touch point. These are like CRO type trade-offs or customer experience type trade-offs that like a more strategic leader will be thinking about versus like, how do we squeeze every dollar out of every interaction? So I don't know, something else to think about.
Great point. It's a really good
point. But if you had Meta CX, you wouldn't have to worry about all of that.
Well,
sorry, I just could not resist that.
I think on this point in particular, it's also one that don't make any decision here lightly. Be very deliberate and intentional about this, because you can very quickly end up with CS teams with a ton of scar tissue where forecasting renewal becomes a challenge, because as soon as Jill puts the renewal op in, immediately the CRO is like, well, Jill, what's the status? You put it in for 400K. What are we going to do? Do you need an SE on this? You're not going to close it correctly. I've seen that happen a few times, and I think we've all heard that story. And that's a big fail long-term for your customer success motion versus being, as we've said before, deliberate. What does make sense at what stage of what part of the customer journey to value to add in a new person? Should that new person have a sales skill set? Should they have a customer health and happiness skill set? Should they have a technical skill set and all of that? I think that's a very important point to call out here. I hate to say it, folks, we are almost at time here. So before we wrap, I would just love for you to take a second and think through a key takeaway for our audience today. We've covered a lot of ground. I feel like this is an MBA course distilled into about 45 minutes here. But really one tweet length takeaway for our audience members here today on the future of the CRO, the future of what this looks like. Lou, let's start with you.
Okay, mine would be that I-shaped CROs become VPs of sales, and T-shaped CROs become CEOs. So it just goes to like expanding your skill set and your purview a little bit more than you might think.
Jill,
Yeah.
length takeaway.
Mine's kind of kitschy, but being a CRO is the hardest job you'll ever love.
And
And finally, Jake.
mine is actually a little bit like Lou's. Good sales leaders prioritize ARR and TCV, and great ones prioritize NRR and LTV. That's really what draws the distinction between a VP of sales and a CRO.
Mhm.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, folks, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I know you're all incredibly busy. Thank you for sharing your perspective and spending some time sharing all of your thoughts on what a CRO role is, what it's evolving to, and how it's going to play in the future. On behalf of Gina and the team behind the scenes, all the folks watching this on YouTube in the future, thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody.
Everyone.
Thanks, Rich.